hey, it's going to be hard and it's going to be uncomfortable and you're probably going to relapse. And like, if you still want to go forward, you can. But just know it's going to be a bumpy road, right? So how do you lose 100 pounds? You stop thinking about 100 pounds. Because every day that I think about 100 pounds and how far I am from whatever weight I want to lose, my brain is registering me as a failure. So let me take this idea. I know that I want to move towards it, but if every day I'm looking at this, and the idea is good in theory, if I see that it's going to motivate me and help me like aspire towards this lofty goal, but instead what our brain is most of the time doing, look how far you are from that. Look how far away that is. Look at how you're nowhere near it. And it's actually undermining our efforts because our default biological setting, if you will, is what I call a famine biology. Let's be fat and let's not move.
Welcome to Her Desired Haven Podcast, a community where we come together to discuss all things Jesus, family, life, and faith. I am your host, LaShondra. Thank you so much for tuning in with us today. We have another incredible guest. Today's guest has overcome food addiction, emotional eating, and self-sabotage, as well as burnout, and is passionate about helping others to do the same. His science meets spirit approach empowers people to reclaim their health, identity, and their freedom. Today, he's going to share how to break destructive cycles and how to rewire the brain and step into the life that you were created for. Please welcome Coach Jonathan McLernon to the show.
Thank you. When I hear that, it always sounds like quite a lofty intro. And I'm like, oh man, I hope I can live up to that.
Oh no, yes, you can. Everyone says that. They're like, oh my goodness, like now that you read all of that back, I did all that stuff. No.
I think, if you'd have told me when I was like 20 years old and trying to figure out my life, that this is where I was going to find myself in my early 40s, I probably couldn't have handled it. Like it wouldn't have made sense to me. I'm like, no, that's not going to happen. Like, me? What?
And you probably would have ran the other direction, right? That's usually, I find a common thing with that. Like, usually the thing that God's called you to do is like, it's not really your first pick. And sometimes it's terrifying. Yeah.
About my 11th, no joke, when I consider like my I'll call it my employment history or vocational history. I've had about 11 different professions, and it was like,
oh wow,
almost like God had to let me go through all these different ones to keep finding out this isn't where I'm supposed to be until finally I had no other choice. I shouldn't say I have no other choice, but I got close to it. Maybe it'll come out a little bit in the story, but that's how I ended up doing what I was doing. Basically, is after the failure of one of my businesses, it was like, okay, now what? You're not great at being an employee, not because I'm a bad person, but because I don't fit well into that box. Mm-hmm. Why don't you finally do that thing I've been nudging you to do for a very long time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think even in those seasons where we're doing things, he's teaching us stuff, and whatever it is that he wants us to do later on in life, like those skills that we pick up along the way, like they're valuable and they actually help us. And you're like, oh, okay, I see why you had me go through that or work at that place or do this, because he uses everything. Nothing's wasted.
I love that thought, actually, and that's a great way to think about it, because it could be tempting to go like, oh man, how many years did I waste? And it's like nothing was wasted, because it was kind of all everything added to like my let's say toolkit, so that now when I do the work that I do, I'm able to bring a variety of different, I don't know if it's a variety of perspectives, but a different level of understanding, because of what I've done when someone comes to me like in whatever life experience they're going through.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's always the mindset that I try to have. So you have overcome so many things. You've overcome food addiction, emotional eating, and self-sabotage. How were you able to actually break free from these things? What's your story?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm like, I sometimes think when people hear that question that they would like to hear just a tidy answer, like, oh, I did this 3-step method and I was now set free. It's like, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Not you, I mean the listener. Maybe a better question is, how did I get there in the first place? Because it wasn't necessarily how I started out. And we can go to any depth you want to, but I'll just give a very brief primer. When I was about 29 years old and I was living in South Africa, I was nearly murdered, and so it was a very violent incident. It was very traumatic at the time to go through PTSD, and I didn't know how to navigate those waters. I don't know if anyone's ever equipped, obviously, to go through that kind of stuff. But the fallout from that was I didn't know how to cope with trauma, and it wasn't like I made this intentional decision. It was like I dissociated from myself and my body as a way of trying to cope with what happened to me for a period of time, which sort of imprinted these habits and patterns of behavior that left me struggling for a number of years. And I tried to, I tried to like use my own intellect to like wrestle my way out of this. Like if I could just find the perfect meal plan, or if I could just find the perfect training plan and things, because I gained a lot of weight, I became morbidly obese, and I was trying to think my way out of it. And
Mhm.
there's actually somewhat of a fascinating parallel here when I look back. In that experience, one of the things that God showed to me was you're a cerebral Christian. In other words, you've given me your brain, but not your heart. You're smart enough that you can quote verses and you can say things that sound good, but you're hiding your heart from me, basically. And I
Mm.
think, gosh, God had to take me through an experience where I nearly died to wake that up in me, basically. Um,
Yeah.
and so when it comes to this, I was still trying to think my way through it, and it was trying to solve a problem that couldn't be solved through like intellect, or not certainly not intellect by itself. And it wasn't until about 6 or 7 years into this struggle that it was just years of mental health struggle, hardship, not understanding myself, self-loathing, even as a Christian, thinking, I mean, I was trying to be a Christian, but in my despair, I didn't really know what to do.
Mhm.
When someone came into my life as a coach, basically, I was looking for someone to help me lose weight again. And he modeled for me compassion, and compassion in a way that I'd never felt or understood before. And I don't even know if this man was ever a Christian or is one. Um, but it was his work with me from a place of compassion that radically transformed my view of myself, my body, my health.
Mhm.
And it just opened an entire new perspective. Like, this wasn't a problem to be solved with macros or training plan. This is a problem. This was a heart problem.
Yeah.
And it started with my relationship to myself.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think a lot of the issues that people struggle with, whether it be weight or eating or money or anything really, it's always starts with the heart. Like it's always going to
Mm-hmm.
be the heart. And that's what God looks at, right? It starts right there. So I'm glad that you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that because that's so true. It's a heart problem, and that's what needs to be dealt with first.
Yeah, I like the thought that all behavior makes sense. And it's this kind of interesting perspective I've adopted. It doesn't mean that all behavior is good. It doesn't
Hmm.
mean that all behavior is beneficial, but it means if we understand the human condition, we can come to an understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. So
Hmm.
in my case, I didn't understand why I was doing what I was doing. I didn't understand the trauma response. Like I wasn't at
Yeah.
that point sort of educated to deal with these things. And so instead, there was this thing, this beast that I was struggling with in terms of food addiction and binge eating. Mercifully, I didn't turn to alcohol and drugs to cope with my trauma, but I didn't understand why I was doing this thing. I didn't understand why I seemed to have no control over myself. I didn't understand why I'd almost like black out and just start voraciously eating. All I knew that I was a horrible human being that like seemed to be stuck in this destructive cycle. And no matter how smart I wasn't enough to figure my way out of this.
Hmm.
And it's I think back now with compassion, I think what an awful perspective to have in one sense. Maybe I had to sit stuck in that place until it left a mark. And then
Hmm.
and then God showed me a different view, that it's like, what if you're actually not the worst human being who's ever lived, and maybe actually you're just a struggling human being who's in pain.
So, for someone who's listening, I guess, how can they begin to identify that they actually have a food addiction and it's becoming like a
Mm-hmm.
serious problem?
Yeah, well, I like to distinguish between what I call like above the neck and below the neck hunger, and
Mhm.
I'll put everything comes with nuance, right? So I'll put one small caveat in here. Human beings have consumed food in some emotional capacity since probably the beginning of time, right?
Yeah.
Their feasts and celebration have gone together because it's the breaking of bread, the sharing of resources, community, that kind of thing. So I would like to say that all eating has some degree of emotional component to it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You won't hear me say food is just fuel. That's an attempt to just completely divorce ourselves from the emotion of eating. Whereas God, in some contexts, has given us food for pleasure. But there's more like what I'll call destructive emotional eating. This is when we start to use food maybe in a different way. We're using it to escape what we're feeling in our head. We're using it to cope with the stresses we experience. It becomes very clear that we're not just eating to nourish, but we're eating to escape. We're eating, like, I do believe some degree of honesty that we can recognize when we're doing something destructive. Like when I'm eating a 6 pack of donuts, like there's really no justification, celebratory or whatever, to
Mhm.
explain that pattern of behavior. Um, I would feel awful afterwards. So, eating that leaves you feeling awful afterwards, or if you feel like there's a loss of control, loss of ability to regulate your consumption of food, These are all kind of indications that you might be using food in an unhealthy way. And one of the byproducts that often becomes weight gain. It's not always the case. And there can be other eating disorders like, bulimia, and a few others like that, where you try to mitigate some of the damage of what you're doing. But it's very clear that what you have is disordered relationship with food. You're starting to use it to solve problems that food was never intended to solve, to escape things that food really can't actually provide an escape for. Because maybe, like in my case, I would say like my head didn't feel like a safe place to be, and you can't take your brain out. And so instead you have to numb and check out and things like that. So you start to notice these kinds of patterns emerging. But I also want to say, just if you start to observe these patterns and you become aware that these are destructive patterns that you have, to not be unkind towards yourself. Compassion doesn't mean get out of jail free, right? It doesn't mean, oh, you've had a hard day, keep doing this thing that's hurting you. But it also doesn't mean you're the worst human being on the planet. It just means you're a human being who's struggling in pain. So you're not necessarily trying to justify it and say, keep doing the thing that's hurting you, but you're saying, let's take a step back and think about this from another perspective. Like, what need is this meeting? What problem is this solving for you, even though it's not a great solution?
Yeah, it's almost like it's become like a coping mechanism, an unhealthy one, because it could really get seriously bad if you're not, really monitoring it.
Yeah. It's funny when you say coping mechanism. This isn't my own thought, and I'm trying to think of where it came from. There is a psychologist who writes a little bit about maybe coping mechanisms not being as healthy as we think, even. And I believe it ties into resilience. So it's maybe a coping mechanism, even if, let's say if you're stressed and use a breathing exercise, these aren't necessarily bad things to do to help regulate your nervous system, but even, let's say, so-called healthy coping mechanisms, there's sort of maybe a hidden message in there that you don't have the capacity to handle this. And I believe that we are created with a greater degree of resilience than we might give ourselves credit for. Sometimes it takes going through the most difficult and profound experiences to really unlock that realization or awareness. And I wish I could expand more on that thought. I haven't yet sat with it for long enough, but I just wanted to put that seed thought out there for people that, maybe we're more resilient than we give ourselves credit for.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so you speak a lot about science meets spirit, and you use this approach with your coaching. So can you explain the benefits that you've seen, I guess, with combining the two?
Yeah, well, I have a pretty strong scientific background from chemistry and like high-level math and physics, and I was a nanotechnology researcher. I've been a marine engineer. I've been a power line technician. So working in sort of very high skill, strong foundational science backgrounds, largely related to math, physics, and chemistry. And I have quite a good brain for pattern recognition as well. That's one of the things that I seem to do well. I seem to observe patterns. Sometimes it's frustrating because I can see patterns that are unhealthy, but I can't tell someone that they're unhealthy because they're not ready to hear it. But really, I think science itself is incomplete in terms of describing the human experience, or maybe what we think of as science. There's what we call a scientific method, right? It's a way to study and learn things. But science itself is not the exclusive source, and it doesn't have the tools to be the exclusive source of truth. So it can be used to inform, which is great. I can maybe explain a little bit of neuroscience, why you're doing this, or a bit of psychology in terms of why you're doing this, or draw on biology and metabolic health, or biochemistry, and say, hey, here's why you might be doing these things, or here's why this thing might be happening in you. But by itself, it's incomplete to explain the full thing. So when we draw in spirit and story, and we go, because our brain is really I'll call it like a meaning-making machine. In other words, it tries to interpret our experiences and create a story to explain our patterns of behavior. And so we need to look at like what is the human condition sort of outside the bounds of science. Science can study the mind, but we can't put it in a jar. Like what is a mind, right? We can study life, but what is the essence of us that animates us? It's particularly, and believe me, like in the world of like chemistry and physics and high-level mathematics, it's not that everyone's an atheist, but there are a lot of atheists in there. I was surrounded with a lot of that, and that's okay. They're trying to interpret the world that way. It's just that science itself is an incomplete arbiter of truth, might I say. And so we need to account for the lived human experience of each individual. So now I can maybe draw on a scientific principle, but one of the arts of high-level coaching is, how do I take this principle and help adapt it for you and your unique set of circumstances? So we might be able to explain in one context what you're doing, but we need to know like the story behind it as well in order to make the picture complete.
Okay, so Transitioning just a little bit, I want to
Mm.
talk about how sometimes I guess maybe habits and mindsets could be passed on from one like generation to the
Oh
next.
yeah.
How do we begin, or maybe someone's listening and they don't even recognize that they've adapted some of these mindsets and habits? How do we begin to break, first, I guess, rewire our brains and break those destructive
Hmm, hmm.
cycles and patterns?
Yeah, and Rewire is a fascinating one because we're talking about neuroplasticity now. But you're also touching on something else, which I won't go too deep into, but we could probably describe as intergenerational trauma because that's
Yeah.
probably a whole other conversation. It's wildly fascinating how that can happen. But really, the people, let's say our parents in particular, those who we grew up with, who raised us, their patterns of behavior we observe as young children. And I'm a parent of young children now, so I'm very aware of this, of what I do, even though I'm certainly not a perfect parent, but I'm so aware that my children are studying and going to model my behaviors, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, and as an adult, especially working the field that I do, to look at my parents and see their patterns of behavior and understand where some of mine came from is quite profound. I love my parents dearly. I'm very fortunate. I have a very good relationship with them. They're dear to me, but I can also see where some of my patterns came from. That,
Yeah.
like, through certain experiences, And so, how do we rewire? Well, the first is, if we think about how our brain formulates a pattern of behavior. So when we repeat a pattern of behavior, we have, let's say, a baby habit. So neurons start to shake hands. They're like, "Hey, do we want to wire this into our brain?" In other words, your brain's trying to figure out, do I continue down this path or not? If in the first 7 to 10 days you don't continue to repeat the pattern of behavior, those neurons are going to disconnect. We're not going to create a circuit in your brain. But let's say you continue to, I call it a baby habit because, like, babies need, like, a lot of attention, a lot of nurturing, a lot of conscious effort to make it happen. Um, Within the first couple of months, you might move into an an adolescent habit. So now this habit still needs some degree of, like, you still got to raise it, raise this adolescent. You can't just leave them to their own devices, but doesn't need quite as intensive, like, care and attention. But you still want to be repeating that behavior as frequently as you can. For about 3 to 12 months is when it starts to become, like, I'll call it you're transitioning into an adult habit.
Mm.
And depending on the complexity of the habit might also, this 21 days to form a habit sounds great on social media, but the reality is it's often more complex than that because it depends on how difficult the thing is you're trying to pattern.
Mm.
But somewhere between 3 and 12 months, there's this process called myelination. So what's happening there is, like, the neurons, that's the cells in your brain, they start to shake hands, they start to wrap together, and then your brain starts to make a sheath around it. Almost like if you look on the inside of a wire, you'll see, like, the angel hair copper, and then you'll see
Mm.
some, like, insulation, and there's, like, the full
Mhm.
colored, like, blue or red or green or whatever. Your brain's doing that process as well. Once that happens, once that's been myelinated, you basically have a hardwired habit. And so we now have expression. It's like riding a bike. What we're really talking about is, even if you don't do something for a number of years, just like that, it can come back very, very quickly. And actually, that can be really
Mm.
discouraging for people when it comes to, like, unhealthy or destructive patterns of behavior, because
Right.
it's like, oh, I thought I'd left this behind me, and then boom, it just was, like, right there again. So there's kind of that aspect to it. But the other part of it is, sometimes if our brain has a certain belief, I'll call a belief, a thought that we hold to be true, regardless of factual accuracy. Our beliefs shape our patterns of behavior. So we
Mm.
form a framework of beliefs to try to um, make sense of the world and figure out how we navigate the world. I don't know what to do in this situation. I'm going to turn to my beliefs to guide me. Now, what happens if you have a repeated thought, a repeated pattern of behavior that leads to an unhealthy story about why you're doing that thing? I am a terrible person. And now that story gets repeated enough times that I now believe that I am a terrible person because of my struggle. Um, I'm addicted to chocolate. Or I'll just use that as a very simple one in a sense. Well, what my brain's going to do is going to try to nudge my patterns of behavior to be in alignment with that story or belief that I hold to be true. The brain's trying to keep some sense of internal coherence. So when I go to change a pattern of behavior, if it doesn't line up with my sort of ingrained sense of identity, my brain may actually undermine or self-sabotage as a safety mechanism. Hey, whoa, you're doing this thing that doesn't line up with your sense of identity or your identity congruence. And so it's going to nudge me back to doing this thing. We might go, why do I do this thing that I want to change or I know is unhealthy or not helping me? Because there's some identity level work that needs to happen. And maybe I could use as a bit of a segue into this. Passively or actively, our sense of identity is shaped. Most people's passively. And when I talk about actively shaping your sense of identity, for some people it might start to veer into the direction of woo, but I actually try to keep it fairly grounded and scientific, right? The habits and patterns that we do every day shape our sense of identity. The internal dialogue that we have shapes our identity. The people that we're around kind of shape our identity. But we can take an active hand in this. We can start to think about, well, who do I want to be? Maybe we could say our sense of identity in one context is a picture we hold about ourselves in our head. This is who I am. This is how I fit into the world. This is, and so on. But what if we start to shift the story, and think about things differently? Here's the person I'm becoming. Here's the person I want to be. And the way that we change an unhelpful pattern of behavior is we have to start establishing a new pattern of behavior. The challenge here is the old pattern is very well established and it doesn't require much conscious thought, right? We can just do it automatically. It's called a habit. The new pattern of behavior is not yet a habit or a full-fledged adult habit, so it requires conscious cognitive effort to repeat that pattern of behavior. So there's this struggle back and forth. So there's this context that says relapse isn't natural to change as exhaling is to breathing. In the process of trying to create change, it's almost inevitable that you will relapse into an old pattern of behavior. Not because you're a bad person, not because you're weak, but your brain gets tired. And so if your brain gets tired, you're going to default to the pattern of behavior that requires the least energy to complete. The one that's the most habitual, doesn't require much thought. So that in itself is going to happen as well. But I want to encourage people to think about just this idea of you can actively shape your identity. You can actively change your internal dialogue and start to move in a direction you want to go. Now, to be fair, there's limitations to this. I can't talk my way into becoming a PGA golfer, right? Like, no matter how much I believe, I'm not going to become a PGA Tour. I'm 43 years old, right? That's just not going to happen. I haven't golfed like for 20 odd years. So it is bound a little bit by, reality. It's not so much I can just manifest whatever universe or reality I want kind of thing. But we can, as long as it's sort of within the context of what's actually realistically possible for you, you can move towards what is maybe the best possible version of yourself. And so I encourage people to do that, to take an active hand in trying to shape their identity.
Wow, this is really fascinating. I have to do more research and reading up on this. It's actually really, really fascinating. So you speak a lot about how you lost 100 pounds, right? And you kept it off. And I think a lot of people are like, they can lose it, but it bounces right back. So how were you able to accomplish that? And you said something about you used your brain to accomplish it, right? So what exactly is brain-driven weight loss?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I want to say, like, I've had that. I joke that I've lost 600 pounds, right? Because I've also, I'd love to say, hey, in 3 easy steps, I lost 100 pounds.
That's what everyone wants to hear. I mean, we want the easy way, but
yeah. Well, and that's the thing is if it was going to work, it would have worked already. But I want to give one example, and I forget where this comes from. I don't know if it's James Clear in Atomic Habits, one of these other books. But Oprah Winfrey, for example, she's one of the most powerful, influential people in the world. Is a billionaire and has access to the smartest, wealthiest, whatever, like just this, and struggles with her weight. And that's not a knock on her character. That's pointing to even someone with the access to like pretty much limitless resources still struggles with this. That tells you like, it's if there was going to be like the easy solution, she would have found it. Because she has all the resources. Yeah. Okay. So if we can, it's a real unfortunate thing. I joke that this is not going to sell a lot of programs. So I'm like, hey, it's going to be hard and it's going to be uncomfortable and you're probably going to relapse. I'm like, if you still want to go forward, we can. But just know it's going to be a bumpy road, right? So how do you lose 100 pounds? You stop thinking about 100 pounds. Because every day that I think about 100 pounds and how far I weigh out from whatever weight I want to lose, my brain is registering me as a failure. Right? So let me take this idea. I know that I want to move towards it, but if every day I'm looking at this, and the idea is good in theory, if I see this is going to motivate me and help me like aspire towards this lofty goal, but instead what our brain is most of the time doing, look how far you are from that. Look how far away that is. Look at how you're nowhere near it. And it's actually undermining your efforts because our default biological setting, if you will, is what I call a famine biology. Let's be fat and let's not move. Why? Because, well, what is body fat? Body fat is stored energy for future famines. It's our shock absorber for famines, basically. And the more fat you have, the better you are equipped to survive a famine. Your biology is not looking at how, heart disease or whatever. It's looking at how do I survive the next 3 months or 6 months of food insecurity? Because for most of human history, we didn't have a lot of food, and we had to physically labor really hard to get that food. So you take that biology, that famine biology, and plunk it into the 21st century, where we have supermarkets filled with cheap junk food that's literally just, your brain is wired to, you eat this and it just lights up like you're on crack. You're like, what? Why can't I stop eating this thing? It's because it's been very, very carefully engineered. So I guess I'm digressing a little bit from the original question here, but I guess I want people to understand that, like, this is really tricky, and it's not necessarily a character flaw or a weakness on your part. It's part of the human condition to struggle. So let go of the big idea and go, at 100 pounds lighter, how might I be living differently? Going back to habits. Well, I'll probably be active every day or almost every day. I'll probably make good choices around my meals most of the time, not all the time, not perfect, I'll probably strive to get good quality sleep. I'll manage my stress and so on and so forth. So that we can kind of figure out what are the fundamental principles I'm going to be living by if I'm at that weight. Because what we want to let go of is, I just have it's almost gone, but it still exists in our society. I'll call it the diet mentality. I just have to do this temporary thing to get to this goal, and then I can go back to what I was doing before. It's like, we can't. Now things get tricky, because what you actually have to do is change your identity. Right? So we're starting to tie some things together. If you do all the effort but don't change your identity, as soon as you take the external constraint off, the diet, you're going to revert back to who your brain sees you to be. And you're going to undermine yourself. And also, if you don't address the reasons why you're eating the food, outside of I'm a bad person, and actually, no, this is because I'm trying to cope with this thing here and so on. Once you take the external constraint off, aka the diet, you're going to go back to that thing. So you actually have to become a transformed person.
Yeah.
In other words, you have a new sense of identity, a new way of living. You're not going to go back to those habits. Now, hopefully you come to understand that those habits aren't actually serving you, but they're hurting you. I don't need to binge anymore because I don't need it. I've taken care of that problem. So oftentimes is, can we uncover excess weight as a story, not a story, a symptom of a deeper story. So if we're carrying around extra weight, there's likely a story behind why we're using food in the way we are. There will be some biology too. So let's just say I kind of got the fat genetics. What do I mean by that? I looked through my family history and I got lots of obese people. Does it mean they're all just fat, lazy people? No. It actually means I have this theory, and it's totally unproven, but I'm like, if you look at survival through the ages, the people who can store fat easier are going to survive famines better. So down through the ages, generation after generation, you're starting to see more and more people who could store fat more efficiently survive, and those who couldn't store fat well die off in famines sooner. And so,
oh goodness,
by process, right? So you have the genetic factor, you have the social factor, like socioeconomic factor, you have like the biological factors, and so on and so forth, like all these different things that you're working up against. And that can sound really, really discouraging until we go, okay, let's just put that big goal you have in the shiny upper drawer. We know we want to get there, but let's figure out each day, how is your life going to look? Because you're not going to get there in one giant leap. You're going to get there through incremental baby steps, little by little. One more thing though, what makes you willing to do this? Because this might just start to feel like a grind. What's the point? Without this, you probably won't stick with it either. Like, how do you want your life to be different, and why does it mean something to you? So I'm a dad, and I say, like, I don't want to be a sideline dad. I don't want to be stuck, like, just having to watch my kids and not be able to play with them. I want to be present in their lives. And so I can take the love that I feel for my kids and use that as what I might call my emotionally compelling reason. Because our emotional brain is much stronger than our thinking brain in terms of influencing your immediate patterns of behavior. When you're struggling with should I eat the cupcake or not, the way you resolve the tension is you eat the cupcake and wrestle with the guilt later. Pay the price for your crime, right? So your emotional brain is stronger than your thinking brain in that context. It will override it. Knowing that, can we leverage that instead of pretend it doesn't exist? What do I want more? What means, like, in a deeper, more purposeful sense of my life? What does this mean to me?
So during your weight loss journey and overcoming addiction and stuff like that, how did that really impact your relationship and your faith in God?
Hugely. First off, I realized that God didn't hate me for my sin.
Mm.
That was a big one, is thinking that I was like the least like worthwhile human being on the planet, and that God must hate me because I'm such a sinful, struggling human being. And coming to realize that he doesn't hate me. This doesn't mean he was saying keep sinning, keep doing the things hurting you. It just means that I don't hate you for this. In fact, I love you so much that I'm going to send Jesus to pay the price for your sin so you don't have to carry that burden with you.
Mm.
Doesn't mean it's a license to keep doing the things hurting you, though, right? I think we sometimes forget this, that sin separates us from God, and God wants to be with us. So he's made atonement for us, but if we keep inviting sin back into our life, we keep creating separation between us and God. So, but that's a bit of a sidetrack. But really, it was coming to realize that God doesn't hate me. He doesn't hate me for my struggles. In fact, he wants to help me with my struggles. In fact, the struggles that I have, maybe I don't even resent them. I don't like them a lot of the time, to be fair. I'm like, gosh, it'd be easier if I didn't have this multiple thorns in the flesh, so to speak. But it, it keeps me reaching out to God. It also, I think, has a way of humbling us. I'd like to say I have a pretty good brain. And it's not me saying I'm better than anybody else, right? But I got it free of charge, right? I got it free at birth. My dad has a photographic, like encyclopedic memory. And, my mom has this immense amount of creativity. And I seem to get kind of both mashed together. So I have a very, very good IQ and EQ. But again, I can't really take the credit for it because I didn't ask for it. I didn't earn it or anything like that. I just got it. And that's why I call it a gift. But in my own hands, I just ended up in the pit of despair. I just ended up in I'll say my life kind of in shambles. Mm-hmm. And so, but it's like you go through these different experiences and starting to realize that God taking me through some really hard experiences, like nearly dying, like losing my life savings in a failed business venture with a Christian brother who betrayed me, and stuff like that. How do you rebuild from that? Having my faith entirely rocked because of serial abusers in the ministry from the faith group I'm a part of, and things like that. But what are all these experiences doing? In one sense, they're showing me the limitations of myself and my abilities. You have these gifts, you have these wonderful gifts I've given you, and in my care, I can help you steward those gifts to serve other people. But outside of my care, these gifts often have a downside that kind of leads to your inevitable destruction. And so it humbled me in a way that I realized that I can't think my way through this stuff. I can't smart my way through this stuff. That I still have to rely on God to help guide my gifts. And so I try to do that every day now.
Yeah. Someone needs to hear that. God doesn't hate you. He hates sin, but he doesn't hate us. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I like to think that he hates sin because it separates us from him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it says desire that we would be a part of his family.
Absolutely.
I think so many people, they want to picture God as sitting there with a hammer just waiting to smash people, because don't forget, when we read stuff in the Old Testament, for example, which is some pretty hard reading at times. I'm not going to I'm not going to sugarcoat this, right? But we read sometimes hundreds of years worth of history in a single chapter. And so we miss the context. And so we tend to compress it all and think God was just waiting there. Bam. I'll give one example. The Canaanites, who were for 400 plus years, 5 of our lifetimes, sacrificing children to the god of Molech, burning them alive to this god that doesn't exist. And God himself witnessed this and still didn't destroy them. He tried to reach them. And when he couldn't reach them, eventually he sent the children of Israel, not because they're perfect, but they became his instrument of judgment. But we want to talk about long suffering. Imagine for 400 years watching people do this thing that is the most heinous evil imaginable, and he still didn't destroy them yet. Or Noah and the flood. I'm going to do something so crazy that you cannot ignore it. Everybody would have been talking about it. And yet, it gave, people say 100 years, I think it was 75, but the numbers don't really matter. He gave basically an entire lifetime for people to come to terms with this before he rendered his judgment. And I think there's something important for us to understand is God is long-suffering. He is patient. He gives us a lifetime. Some are longer than others, right? Some people have a short life, but he gives us a lifetime. But there is a judgment at the end of that. And I try to keep that in mind. It's not because God wants to swing a hammer. He's giving us this life to invite, I want to be a part of your life. And your life will even be better with me in it. I think it was some of the most fundamental Christian principles. Self-denial, Self-denial prevents addiction. The path of self-indulgence leads to addiction, and addiction leads to death. Self-denial actually makes your life better. And that's the message the world doesn't want you to hear. Do the thing that makes you feel good. Feels really good in the moment, and it will kill you. Right? So self-denial is not necessarily about ruining your life. It's about saving you from death.
Yeah.
Every principle that God taught through Jesus is about making our quality of life better every day.
Yeah. Speaking of the Bible, what is your favorite Bible story? Well, one of your favorite Bible stories, or a verse that you just love to go back to?
Well, I would say I find myself really identifying with Daniel. And I didn't like in one of my first Bibles I have written in like the first page. I would have been like maybe 7 or 8 years old, and it says Daniel, page 640, Daniel 6, page 644. In that Bible, on page 644 is the start of Daniel chapter 6. And it's the story of Daniel in the lion's den. I didn't really realize my affinity for Daniel was maybe a bit more than me just being like in awe of this story about Daniel in the lion's den, but about who Daniel is and who his character is. And finding a lot of affinity. So in a very simplified way, I go, who is Daniel? You know, in the early stages of his life, he's a courageous man who stood up, you know, when everybody else wanted to bow down, because he wouldn't bow down to anybody but God, you know, and he was willing to die for that. He wasn't afraid of that. He was an advisor to royalty. So he, and oftentimes I think, well, what am I doing? Because every one of us is royalty in God's eyes, in a sense. Because God is the royal family. He's the king, right? Like, and we're invited into his family. So we're actually part of the royal family. And I go, what do I do with these gifts I've been given? Is I can see things in others through all these different experiences in life. God has refined this gift and refined me, brought me to this place that I recognize that I have this gift. And in his care, I can steward this gift and essentially be like an advisor to royalty.
I think I identify closely with David, being overlooked, underappreciated, being seen as too young, but still being rejected, you know, by man, but being called by God.
Yeah. You know, this is the thing about like story and why these things are kept on record is there's a few things that are really wonderful about it. The human condition doesn't really change because it's, you know, God set it in motion. And so we can read these stories of old and we can read these books of wisdom and we think like this wisdom is timeless, which is quite something. Yes, the language changes, you know, if you're reading like archaic, you know, Victorian English in the King James Version versus whatever. RSV and NASB 95 are my choices of translation now. But we see ourselves in these stories and they give us hope. You know, you think about David and some of the most like terrible sins that he committed, and yet he was a man after God's own heart. And I love that. You know, if you're a woman after God's own heart, you're like, as flawed as I am, as you know, I'm pursuing God's heart. You know, isn't that like, it's just amazing? It's wonderful. And we see ourselves in that, we feel inspired by it and go, hey, if it was possible with this man who was just a human in one sense, like the rest of us, like this is possible for us. So stories inspire us.
Yeah, and it definitely keeps us encouraged. So I know you have a podcast as well. Can you share with our community where they can connect with you or listen to your show?
Yeah. So the podcast itself has been on hiatus for a little period of time after the birth of my second child. It kind of had to go on hiatus just from a time commitment perspective, but there's over almost 140 episodes published. It's called Between the Before and After, and it's really about exploring the stories of people who faced adversity and how they got through that adversity. Not every story is Christian, but there are a number of Christians on there. And I realize once I revive it in the future, it's probably going to be mostly a Christian themed podcast because I've since like found my voice and my courage to speak up more publicly about my faith.
Yeah.
But I also, I write on Substack. It's the way that I sort of find a place for my voice. Wrestling with Truth is, or you can look up Coach John McLernon. Wrestling with Truth is where I write my Christian stuff. And I don't know when someone might be listening to this, but at the time of recording this, I'd recently wrote a series, an Easter series, on the last week of Jesus' life. And I wanted to go back and study that story through maybe a different lens. And I wanted to try to walk myself through it. And I think it's some of the most like impactful writing I've ever done. I literally read my own writing and I'm brought to tears. And I'm not trying to elevate myself, but it was like, I just felt moved to try to, and words kind of just flowed out of me. And as I wrote through and walked through these stories, and I realized I had a level of appreciation I never understood before. I'll just give you one tiny example. Jesus had the power to call down, 12 legions of angels or more, right? He could have, so what I sometimes forget is Jesus had, he was fully human, but fully divine, which is a really hard concept for us to sort of reconcile. But what he had is he had the power of, God granted it to him, but he had the power of heaven at his disposal. So he had the power to absolutely destroy everyone who was doing this to him, and instead he laid down his life. So he was the strongest man that ever lived, right? He was the most powerful man that ever walked the earth, and yet he subjected that power to the will of God.
Yeah.
And chose to sacrifice himself instead of destroying those who would hurt him to complete what God had requested of him. And I'm just speechless when I think about that, right?
Yeah. It's just hearing you say that. It's just incredible. No matter how many times you hear it, it's like every time it's just incredible to hear just how great and amazing God is. So thank you for sharing that. I'll make sure to put all your details and everything in the description so our audience can connect with you. Do you actually mind praying before we leave out today, whether in general or for anyone who might be struggling with addiction, food addiction?
Yeah. Father in heaven, we're so thankful that you see us, you see our hearts, you see us as we are, and we can even come to you as we are. In all our pain, in all our struggle, we can bring this to you, and it's not too much. We're so glad to understand that Jesus paid a price that we couldn't pay, that even our sin could be washed away. We're so grateful for that. And so may we not be discouraged, even in the struggle, the heart of the struggle, but may we cry unto you, call unto you, and just find new strength for the battle, not in ourselves, but in you dwelling in us. We pray in Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to our lovely community for tuning in. Please don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.